assistance to the I3 grantees. My name is Kathy Cox, and I'm one of the technical assistance team members, and I work at the Education Delivery Institute. Today's session is being recorded, and it will be posted in the Scale Up and Sustainability section of the I3 community in a few days. The PowerPoint and other materials are also posted in that community. Would like to point out that at the end of the webinar, please help us and fill out a very brief survey. Your feedback is important to us as we make these webinars relevant and meaningful to the I3 grantees. Now, we also have a little bit of housekeeping here, as you can see on the slide, that in this presentation, we are trying to get some interaction between the participants. And so at the top of your screen, under that little green tab, if you'll pull that down almost like a shade on a window, it should come down and show you this series of menu options. And there's a box up there labeled chat, and we'll be turning to that in just a moment. And this allows you to chat not only with the presenters, but also with other participants. So we ask that you use that feature throughout the webinar. We also want to note that we will not be having a phone-in session later, but we want you to type in your questions that you have that are lingering that we might not have time to answer in this hour-long webinar, and post them in that same chat feature, and we will be sure to get back to those and begin a discussion actually on the website. Now let's get to the content of our webinar for today. We know that most I3 grantees are planning to scale up or are actually currently trying to scale up their implementation. They're trying to reach more students, expand to more sites, moving across districts, bringing in diversity, as well as also even maybe becoming a multi-state effort across the country. The purpose of today's webinar is to discuss how to expand implementation effectively and to expand implementation effectively and quickly, and to be sure that we're actually improving outcomes for students at scale. Now, the two grantees that we have on our discussion today, we're very, very pleased that two individuals who've had extensive experience with Scale Up have agreed to join us to talk about not only their projects, but very specifically their Scale Up experiences. We'll be joined here in a few moments by Tom Emmerich, who's the Executive Director of the Smithsonian Science Education Center, which is a unit of the Smithsonian Institution. And he runs a partnership to validate a shared vision for effective science learning and teaching, working with 75,000 students across the country. And we'll also be joined by Emily Rogers and Jerome D'Agostino, who run the Reading Recovery Program at The Ohio State University, which now, after 30 years, is affecting more than 2 million students across our country. So you'll be hearing from both of these groups and I3 grantees and these individuals about their experiences in just a few minutes. And we thank them for joining us. So let's get started, and this is where we want you to pull down that green tab at the top of your screen and get to your chat button, because we really want to ask you just a couple of questions here at the very beginning. First, what words come to mind when you hear the term Scale Up? Just type your answers into that chat box, and you'll start to see them appear here on our summary screen. Oh, and a reminder on the chat feature, if you'll make sure the default is send to host, and that's exactly where you want to send it. Okay, so we're getting some responses here. When you hear the term Scale Up, some of you think dissemination, getting bigger, cost, replication, bigger, more, expanding into new areas. Yep. Oh, I like this, we have extending and expanding, and I like the clarification that that individual put on there, expanding a successful implementation. I think that's one of the keys here. You don't want to scale up something that's really not working. Expanding effective practices and projects. I like that word, effective, as well. I think that's a good clarification, too, and a good distinction between both practices and projects. Scale up can be either one. Growth, when you scale up, you want it to grow and get bigger. Good. Okay, good. Thank you for that. We'll be sharing our definition of scale up here in just a minute and the things that we think about when we hear that term. We've had a chance to think about it here. So good, thank you. Now let's turn to the second question. And again, please submit your answers to the host. Let's hear about what are your current concerns about scaling up your I3 project. Just type in a few lines or a few words. What are you worried about right now as you think about scaling up your I3 project? Oh, good. Somebody typed in very quickly, maintaining quality. Yep, something you have to be concerned about with scaling up. How are you going to get the money, funding? Application process. So very discrete concern there, already obviously into the planning phase. Management of multiple sites as you start to expand. Again, level of quality, being able to maintain the quality as originally proposed. Logistics. Oh, I like this one. Attending to differences in context from site to site. Always a challenge. How do you maintain your quality standards and your commitment to the model while recognizing that as you expand and scale up, there will be differences in sites? Making sure that as you grow larger, you can maintain successfully. Building internal capacity. We're actually going to specifically suggest that you have to think about that early on. The fidelity piece. And somebody wrote, more work. Yep. Without a doubt, not only thinking and planning for scaling up is more work, but actually doing it is more work. Okay, and how to be flexible. So thinking about how do you, again, what's that magic place between fidelity to your model and maintaining quality and control with flexibility to take in differences and react to new sites, new people, new entities, and new management. Continuity, leadership, being able to use evidence to recruit new sites. That's a good point. You might have enthusiasm, but is there evidence to suggest that this new site will be successful? An excellent point. All right, thank you very much. All of these are excellent, and I know that people have probably typed in things that you think, oh, yep, we're worried about that too. Well, one of the things that I think is helpful as you think about scaling up is to, one, think about the definition. So here, we've proposed a definition, and it really talks about a process. And I think it's important that you realize it is a process. It's not a single event. That scaling up needs to be approached as a process. And as you are thinking about that and beginning that process, really the first couple of steps, these are almost like the givens that you have to have before you even think about starting the process of scale up. And when we think about this list of non-negotiable things, these are really, really important at the very get-go. One, that what you're trying to scale up is a proven evidence-based practice that has clear results. Again, you don't want to be scaling up something that's uncertain, something that is questionable, or something that, quite frankly, is not very successful. Are you trying to scale up something that is clearly aligned with your organizational goals and strategic objectives? You don't really want to spend a lot of time, energy, and effort trying to scale up something that's a one-off from your basic organization. You really have to have full commitment from the leadership to even begin the process of scale up. That's important. You want to make sure that as you're scaling up, you recognize that it's going to have an impact on a specific target or at-risk population that you're working with. You want the scale-up to be realistic, not pie in the sky. So money, funding, and capacity are all important issues that you'll have to consider. And then really want to think about time constraints. So as you're scaling up, how can you ensure that you're going to get those favorable results at a greater scale, knowing that everyone has time constraints to how long they're going to give you to show results. So this is kind of a list of non-negotiables that really have to be in place before you even think about starting the process of scale-up. But what does it take then, next slide, to really have a process of scale-up? Well, we've done some thinking around this too, and have developed a pretty practical approach and a framework for you to think about as you're beginning and undergoing this process. We believe it can be useful to reflect on progress and plan, and we also believe that it will be a good check on how you're doing, and as things evolve and change, something that you can go back to and ensure that you've got in place before you really begin expansion. So there are 7 elements here to the Scaling Up framework, and I'm just going to quickly go through these very, very quickly. There's going to be more to it later in the webinar, but also online as you get into the materials. But really 7 main elements of the framework. First of all, next slide. There's a piece that's really about preparation and assessment of what your organizational readiness is, how well prepared your organization is for change, because scaling up will require your organization to change, and then assessing how ready your stakeholders actually are for scaling up. And basically what we mean by assessing organizational readiness is that given the scope of work, how prepared is your organization to take on this scaling effort? With regard to the preparing the organization for change, what will it take to get the organization ready for the scaling effort? And finally, under the component of assessing stakeholder readiness, do the appropriate stakeholders, both internal and external, have the necessary functions, resources, and processes to successfully implement the strategy? So this is a lot about that capacity issue. So it's about assessing yourself, thinking about and preparing your organization for change, and then assessing the stakeholders both internally and externally for the same issues. Next slide. There's also a big component about developing and executing a plan. And when we say a plan, we don't mean a plan that looks pretty, has a nice committee and a nice title, and then gets put on a shelf. We mean a very concrete plan to guide the scaling effort. And that plan needs to be sure to think through very specifically how the rollout of the strategy across both the organization and all those various stakeholders is going to take place. And this is a piece where you're going to have to spend considerable time in this process to get it right. And of course, it will change. And that's why we say it's a concrete plan, but it's a practical plan. There's another step in this process, too, about evaluation and follow-up. And it's, again, asking the question, do we have the mechanisms in place to understand how well the strategy is being implemented? So in other words, once we roll it out, how do we know it's going to work? That's under evaluation and follow-up, which is the next slide. And finally, on the kind of bookending this whole process, and something that has to be a continual process and something you think about all the time, is around communication and engagement. And it's asking the questions, are we communicating the right messages, engaging the right people throughout all the stages of implementation of the scale-up? So these are 2 things that run across the entire spectrum of the planning and the process here that are a big, big important piece, and a piece that, as somebody said, takes time, energy, effort, and work. Communication and engagement are big, big pieces of this work that folks have to be willing to take on. So that's our framework for how we believe you need to think about this process. Again, there's more information that'll be coming both on the webinar and online, but that I think is just a good quick outline of the things that you need to be thinking about as you begin. Now we're going to turn to Tom Emmerich, who is the Executive Director of the Smithsonian Science Center, who's going to share about his experience in scaling up the LASER project. His effective scaling up really focused on how partners, planning, and capacity building allowed him to see great success with this project known as LASER. So Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you now. Thanks again for joining us.
Kathy. Sure, Kathy, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking your time. I was asked to share kind of our experiences, and I thought one thing, just for a point of clarification, we're the only unit at the Smithsonian that focuses on formal education. So that's why we're kind of a unique duck in a very large pond. But one of the things that the I3 validation grant, we were a recipient in 2010, allowed us to do was to take an existing model, it's called the LASER model, which is just an acronym for Leadership Assistance in Science Education Reform, but to take that model and say, we need evidence that it actually is effective, works, or doesn't. We've done it over about 15 years, but never with the focus and the breadth that we're doing it right now at the same time. So as Kathy said, we're about 70, the grant says 75,000 students. I think we'll actually come close to, at the end of the 5 years, having touched 90,000 students. Those students are in 3 regions. They're in rural North Carolina, rural northern New Mexico, and Houston Independent School District. They're 70% would be considered high needs by the Department of Education's rules. We have an independent research project as part of this validation study that's being done by the Center for Research and Educational Policy at the University of Memphis, which includes a random control trial and case studies. And what makes this project a little unique is this hasn't ever been done before, where you're talking about transforming science education, the core science education at grades 1 through 8, with a random control trial measure over the top of it. So this should be very interesting. We're, in a few days, we'll be entering our 4th year of this 5-year study, which is difficult to believe. There are times it feels like it's been going on 100 years, and there are times it feels like it's been going on a week. And I'm sure all of you feel exactly the same way about your projects. Our demographics, these slides are going to be available, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through them. But what I think is important is that the demographics are representative of what high needs populations look like. And we wanted to make sure that we were exploring our effectiveness with a high needs population, kind of with the thought that if it'll work in these situations, it should work in those that are less economically disadvantaged. So let's talk about the key elements, what our key elements of scaling up have been. One of the things is, in each region, we have a very effective partner. So in North Carolina, we have the North Carolina Math, Science, and Technology Group that is headquartered at the Burroughs Wellcome Fund. In Houston, it's obviously the school district. And in northern New Mexico, it's the Lanel Foundation, which is the Los Alamos National Laboratory Foundation, and who are absolutely committed to improving science education in their areas. Having that local partner that understands the regional differences is critical. In a scale-up, you really have to realize that no matter what you thought you understood about Region A, it is not going to be the same in Region B. And as you continue to scale, you'll get differences all the way along the line. So one of the early lessons we got was in flexibility. Planning. We did 2 things. when we started our project, if you're going to go to scale, and if you're currently scaling and going to scale to greater lengths, planning is really an important part of this. So what we did was say, look, we have to make sure that, one, we're not only building task lists, and then we took those task lists and broke them into 5 different areas. But we also have to build a process, because ultimately the task list won't help you if you don't have a process for implementation. So we've been building process as we go, and it's a continuous improvement process. You heard Kathy say that that plan will change. Well, it will change. But if it's a process, it's a matter of tweaking it, not starting over from scratch. So we did a lot of pre-planning. Before we set boot one on the ground in any of the regions, we met for hours, twice a week, three hours twice a week, and each one of those meetings was centered around those task lists, those 5 task lists, and what it was that we could build as a process that would let us replicate as the need came forward. The other thing that is really important with the pre-planning is a lot of face time with partners. If you're asking these people to truly be partners and not just someone you do things to, but you do things with, it requires a lot of planning. And I know our friends at The Ohio State University are probably sitting there shaking their head, because in my opinion, they're masters at that, in working with people, not at them. So we're really excited about that, and I think that's a critical part. We underestimated the amount of face time it would require in each of the regions, not only with our partners, but with the school districts. In North Carolina, we have 9 different school districts. We have 14 different school districts in northern New Mexico. Each one of them is unique, and of course, Houston is unique to the other 2. So that's really important. So the other thing we had to do that gave us any chance at all at scale was we had to build critical mass at the regional locations. By that I mean, not only did we have to be able to exercise what we knew, but we had to train teachers, not only in professional development on how to use the curriculum and the content behind the science, but more importantly, how to be trainers, how to be good trainers. Because ultimately, those regional sites, you can't afford to do it the way it's done in a project like this forever. So you want to make sure that you have enough folks trained in the right way to do this, that they can not only be local resources, but then they can become resources as you scale beyond their region. An example is we have several areas that want to do, as they refer to them, and we've kind of come up with kind of I3 clones. They want to do the project, and they've raised the funding, and what's important is if we have the process in place, then we can do that. So we've anticipated that depending on the partners, we could probably increase our impact by 350,000 students as early as next summer, based on the number of teachers and just taking the very best of the very best for training. So I think that's something you have to be really aware of. What lessons did we learn? The lead time in planning. You can't over-plan these things because they never go as you expect. Staffing was an issue. Many of you who don't have 2010 grants, we got the word on September 28th that we were approved, and October 1st we were supposed to start full steam. It takes longer than that to get people identified and hired, at least in our organization. So we really hadn't anticipated the amount of challenge that would create. Now we've caught up and we're in great shape on that, but that's something that I'd be aware of when you go to scale. Is you heard it mentioned by Kath at the beginning that how is it going to affect your organization? Well, if you have process for roles, then it's not about individuals. It's about how many people do I need that can execute that process, and it makes it much easier for finding those folks. I think the importance, one of the things we learned was how important our program officer was. We spent a great deal of time with her in pre-planning, making sure she knew what we were going to do and why we were going to do it, and getting not only their approval, but their understanding of why we were going to do it. And it's just critical to have that kind of relationship with the department. What do we wish we had done differently? It didn't take us long to figure out that one of the things had to do with communication. How much communication you're going to have within the regions, whether it's to the schools, to the teachers, to the superintendent, who it's coming from, whether it's from your independent evaluator or from your organization. Managing that so you have the type and the usage and the volume of that managed earlier. I wish we'd have done a better job of that at the beginning, because at some point the receiver becomes numb to different messages. So we could have done a better job, and we do a better job now. Certainly a key thing if you're going to scale things you've learned. Phase 2 management is really important. Because we're a random controlled trial, we have a phase 1 group. Half of our study is phase 1, so they're immediate treatment group. And because it's a public education situation, it's very difficult to do a control group, so we did a delayed treatment group. So in year 4, they'll start. And while we pay a very small stipend to those schools for their participation as phase 2 schools, we ran into a lot of disappointed people when the evaluator shared with them, oh, by the way, you're a phase 2 school, which meant that you get to wait 3 years. Managing that and that participation is very, very important in an RCT. We have actually, knock on wood, have exceptionally low dropout rate from phase 2 schools, because we figured this out fairly early, but we'd have been better off if we'd have gone into it knowing about that. There are a lot of things pulling on schools. So I think that's it. And the other thing that we want to make sure is that you always have to make sure that the effort that you're making matches with, and I know we're going to get to the rubric later, but matches with what the district or the state really wants. And I think there's some evaluation that has to happen there when you scale up, that what you're taking forward is the group that wants to be taken in the direction you're going. And unfortunately, we have a long way to go, so there are a lot of those folks out there. So I think I'll end it there. Just go for questions when they become available.
Great, Tom. And I would encourage everyone to type in, if you have a question for Tom, if you would type it in those into the chat area and send them to the host. We'll be able to see those and get some questions to you. I just kind of want to, one of the things, Tom, that really stuck out for me and kind of encapsulates really all the things that you did right and the lessons you learned was when you said, you know, this is about working with and doing things with, not at. And I think when you think about scaling up and you think of all the different phases you have to go through with your partners, with your potential partners, with the stakeholders, that if the people doing the scaling up can keep that in mind, you're communicating with people, you're engaging with people, you're adapting with people, you're not doing things at them or to them. I think that's just a really, really important mindset that it sounds like your group has had throughout this process, and it's probably one of the reasons you're successful. So thank you for that. I think that was really good for me to hear too. So at this time, we have a question.
So we've got one question coming in. It says, how about building in a planning year for a validation grant? So one of the grantees is thinking about they're in a development grant and thinking about how could we kind of scale up within the I3 experience. And Tom, maybe in your, just to infuse one other concept into your reflection, would be to think about, we've had a number of grantees ask about, you know, an example of a sustainability plan. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about differences between your implementation plans you referenced earlier and a sustainability plan. Are they similar? How are are there big differences in your experience?
Oh, there are big differences. I think probably the largest distinction is that the sustainability plan means that if you did your work right in the first 4 years, you will have not only taken those processes that you've developed, but they will have been enculturated to where in the region you're working, and they'll continue using those processes and modifying them as they need them. That's what will allow for sustainability, because frankly, we won't always be there. We'll be working with other groups. So if we've done our job right, we will have provided enough tool, enough training, and enough experience for them to continue the project, so that when they reach out to us, they're reaching out for a clarification, not for management.
Okay, and the first part of the question was, how about a building in a planning year? Do you think
oh yeah, I love it. I love it. We're a 5-year grant, but the problem is, because we're doing in a validation, you have to have the research, the gold standard research component, which is going to require something like an RCT. You're going to have a treatment group and a delayed group in public ed, and you're really only going to get a year with that delayed treatment group, because your 5th year, you're going to be doing your evaluation reports, because otherwise you wouldn't be getting your data until after the grant actually ends. So I think it would be something that I would like to see the department think about with validation grants, and certainly scale-up grants if they need them, is to, if not a year, at least 6 months. One of the things they did was go to a calendar year rather than the fiscal year, so they may find out in September they don't have to start till January. That helps a lot. We had 2 days. I think there's value there to making sure that you have things figured out before you go jump off the diving board. We were fortunate that we have a lot of really talented people who tried to think about as much of this as possible, but it would be laughable if I could, someday when you have 10 hours, I'll tell you all the things we did wrong and learn from. But well, it's the planning that's it.
Yeah. Well, Tom, we don't have that long, and in fact, I've got one more question, and if you could take just about 2 minutes to answer it. Someone else has written in, it's a very practical, tactical question. Within your 3 regions, what kind of staffing changes occurred, and did your partners help to locate new employees? A very practical question.
It's been one of the greatest challenges for us, because our program depends so much on professional development. We end up having, we may train a teacher in the summer, and by the time fall gets there, they've either left the district, left the control building, or been changed grades, which all of a sudden messes everything up. And depending on the region, that's running between 15 and 30%. So what that has done, this is working with our regional partners, and in each of our regions, I should have said, we actually have a Smithsonian employee who's the regional coordinator. But working with our partners, we've actually developed backfill training plans that don't replace but support what the incoming teacher would have missed. And I would encourage everyone to think about that if professional development is a big piece of your project.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And again, if you think of a question as we go through this process for either one of our 2 grantees that are participating, you can type those in, and we'll relay those to the I3 community and get a conversation going on the website. So you will get an answer. So great. Thank you again, Tom. And
sure.
Congratulations, by the way, on your grant and the work that you're doing. Okay,
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Emily Rogers. Emily, you're joining us today from The Ohio State University. I've learned that. A wonderful place of higher education. You're an assistant professor in the College of Education and Human Ecology. And I also believe you're joined by Jerome DeAugustino, who's a professor in quantitative research, evaluation, and measurement. And you are going to share about not only your program of reading recovery, but really have a chance to reflect for the other other I3 grantees your organic process of scaling up that's really been taking place over 30 years, and how your model and your research have been a big part of what's made your scaling up successful. So Emily, I'm going to turn it over to you. And again, when you finish, we'll immediately take questions. So as she's talking, if you think of something, go ahead and type it in. Emily?
Hi, and hello to everybody. And thank you for getting the in front of the Ohio State University. I'm actually an associate professor, but you know, you got the more important title right, that it's the Ohio State University. It's more important you get that. I'm glad to be here today to talk about our Reading Recovery project. I've been a co-director here at Ohio State of the Reading Recovery Center since 2000. So I've experienced some of this organic kind of business of scaling up. And the first slide I have here, I chose two pictures to show you what I think reading recovery is. It captures the essence of reading recovery. It's a one-to-one early literacy intervention for the lowest achieving first grade students. So you see that slide on the picture on the side. It's one-to-one, lowest achieving first grade students. And the students who receive this instruction, within about 12 to 20 weeks, about 75% of them will catch up to their peers and be reading and writing at average levels. So they come from the lowest to average. And those who don't respond to the instruction, the 15, 25% of children who don't, those are ones that we can more reliably refer on for more testing, assessment, perhaps by the school psychologist, and a more intensive intervention. But reading recovery is also embedded professional development for teachers, and that's the slide. It's kind of in the dark, but you can see some teachers sitting on stools. They're watching a lesson, a reading recovery lesson being taught behind a one-way mirror with their teacher leader, who's a literacy coach, and she's standing to the right. Reading recovery teachers, to train to be a reading recovery teacher, you have to enroll in 2 graduate courses with the university, and to be a teacher leader, you need to complete 15 semester hours post-masters to be a teacher leader. I think the key really to scale up, I think how I describe our experience, is that we've replicated ourselves. And by ourselves, I mean OSU. Reading Recovery started at OSU in 1984 as a project at this university, training these teacher leaders, these coaches, to work with teachers. But it's been replicated in 18 other universities across the country. So when you think about, how am I going to deal with management, how do I work in other places if I'm going to scale up, I think the key for us has been the fact that we've actually replicated ourselves. So there are centers just like the one at OSU in 18 other universities. And they're all our partners on this scale-up grant. Each partner prepares those coaches, and each one of those coaches works with teachers. So as I said, we've got 18 universities. Faculty at those universities prepare coaches. We have about 400 coaches across the country, and each one of those coaches can work with 40 teachers. So you see the immediate ability, I guess, to scale up. The teacher leader, those 400 teacher leaders across the country, I would say that we regard them as change agents. They're the ones who communicate locally. Actually, if you just go back to the first slide, I'm going to go through the other ones quickly, but yeah, there we go. The teacher leaders are the change agents. They're the ones who communicate locally about reading recovery instruction and student progress. So that's another way I think that we're able to scale up and sustain ourselves, because we prepare those coaches to be great teachers of teachers, but also to be able to communicate the results in school districts across the country. Next slide, please. This is our chart of children served over the years. I'd call it a tale of 2 scale-ups, which means we've experienced the best of times and the worst of times. And you can see our numbers grew dramatically up to about 2,000 and then fell off. The last 3 years on that slide, 2010 to 13, are the years of the scale-up grant. Let's see, next slide, please. We have, because we've been around for a while, we've got good experimental data, quasi-experimental data that have been reviewed by What Works Clearinghouse. I like to think of it as the FDA for education. and this slide shows the results or the ratings translated into an improvement index, and you can see that students who receive Reading Recovery make really dramatic gains in terms of fluency, alphabetics, comprehension, and general reading achievement. The fact that we can have this rating, though, it's the highest rating beginning reading intervention. The fact that we can have this rating is because we've collected data on children from the very beginning. So the previous slide, which showed children served in 1984 right up to 2013, every one of those children we have data on to show their progress over the years. And we've also got some, I think 4 or 5 studies that have qualified for that gold standard that WaltWorks Clearinghouse looks for. And so the presence of the data, the research, has really helped us over the years. Next slide, please. This one shows our grant overview. We're in year 4 of our grant, 5-year grant. One of our big goals was to train 3,690 teachers, and we're on target. Very pleased to say we've trained about 2,900 teachers. So far, we have about 770 or 790 more to go in the last year of our grant coming up. So we feel really good about that. We're hitting all of our goals. Okay, Reading Recovery's design. We have, in the next slide, we have, I think, 3 designs, and they're very well developed and described, so that I think that's helped with the fact that we've been able to replicate in different universities. A design for instruction, a design for teacher professional development, and a design for implementation and scaling. Those 3 designs are described in we have a document called the Standards and Guidelines for Reading Recovery. And the way a lesson should look, the way the teacher professional development should go, and the way Reading Recovery should be implemented in school districts. These are all described in our Standards and Guidelines, which leads me to talk about our major contributors to our scale-up on the next slide. I've mentioned research, well-designed research right from the very beginning. Communicating the results of that research, not only the experimental research that's going on, but also the evaluation of student progress, communicating those results to all the stakeholders. And that means for us training teachers, preparing teachers, and the teacher leaders to communicate those results. So you can see we rely on preparing people to be able to communicate the results. We don't just do it, rely on, just us doing it. A sustainable model with distributed leadership. You can go, even though Reading Recovery started at OSU, you can go to Lincoln, Nebraska, or Zanesville, Ohio, and you'll find people who are in charge and developing and carrying out Reading Recovery as though, they own it, and they do. And I think that's been key. An intervention design that can be replicated with fidelity, and timely grants to support scaling and innovation. If you think back to how that second slide, which showed the 30 years growth of and sort of rise and fall and rise again of Reading Recovery, some of that has been due to grants that we've received from the very beginning that have helped us with the scale up. Grants we didn't know were coming. So some things, just sort of came, and because we had the design ready, the research ready, we were able to, sort of had our running shoes on, and we were ready to go and respond when the opportunity presented itself. So I think part of it is careful planning, but also part of it is being ready and able to respond, having the capacity to respond to the opportunity for scaling. Sometimes you just don't know when it's going to come. On my last slide, then I have a summary of some of these ideas. The first one is really important. It's about defining and protecting the brand. We have a royalty. We've licensed Reading Recovery. The license is upheld here at OSU. We issue licenses to universities that are Reading Recovery centers and also to school districts across the country. Every year on a royalty-free basis, as long as they meet standards and guidelines of Reading Recovery. I think, when you're starting out and you're very small, it's not something you really think about, like licensing. But, you might find the name that you've chosen and you've been using for 3, 4, 5 years, and you're growing. That name might be used by someone else, in another part of the country. And so it's really important that I think when you're starting out, right away you get a license for your name, and you define it and develop standards and guidelines so that when you're replicating in other areas, other places, people know what it is, and they can recognize the brand. I think that's part of managing the tension between fidelity and flexibility. The other part of that, too, is if you have standards and guidelines, just like any industry, you also have a process to provide waivers so that somebody who can't meet a particular standard in the school district has to ask, can I have a waiver to do it differently? And then if you do it differently, like tweak the design that you have to research that change, and then be prepared to change your standards based on that research around that change. So I think in terms of fidelity, flexibility, you have to have both, but a process in place with standards and guidelines, a waiver process, and a licensing process helps manage that challenge. And ongoing research, being ready, when the opportunity comes, that you can show your effectiveness. I think one final thought, too, is that our frame of mind is that we're always scaling up. Scaling is not a finite point on the horizon. It's always something that you're working on because there are ebbs and flows in terms of your implementation in other places.
Great. Emily, I think you, particularly in that last part about how you've managed that fidelity versus flexibility with other sites, and you even really, when you think about being in the business of helping kids learn to read over 30 years of different educational environments, being true to a model, I'm sure hasn't been easy. And there's been fits and starts along the way. So thank you for sharing about actually how you do that with protecting your brand, licensing, thinking about a process of getting waivers and so forth. I think that's very, very helpful. I think the other thing that both you and Tom really alluded to as you go to scale up and you begin to expand to other sites, that word ownership. The people who are on the receiving end of this new idea, this innovation, or this project, or this great practice, themselves for it to be successful. And I think both of you have emphasized that in your presentation. And sometimes it takes longer for people to do that than in other places, but it's a really, really important component if this is going to be successful. So those are just some observations I had. Do we have any questions from the audience for Emily about reading recovery and their process of scale-up? Emily, I have a practical question. Because of your emphasis on the brand, protecting the brand, getting licenses, having very solid standards and guidelines, what kind of monitoring do you do once a grant gets started?
What kind of monitoring do we do? So we have these 400 coaches. They're working across many, many districts. They're not just affiliated with one district. Most coaches work with multiple districts. We have a registry process for the coaches. So each university, all the 19 partners, for each of their coaches, they complete a registry application, and they say that this coach has met all the standards. And if they didn't, that they had a waiver for the standard that they didn't, that they weren't able to meet. And then we take those registry applications, and on that basis, we issue licenses to them. The other thing we do, or if it's not a license letter, it's a probationary license. So we'll tell a school district, you couldn't let your teacher, leader, your coach go to our annual professional development session. That's okay for this year, but we can't give you a license. We'll give you a probationary one, and that gives you a year then to come back in compliance and meet all the standards for the following year. The other thing, too, in terms of communication, is that the faculty at the 19 universities with Reading Recovery, we meet twice a year. We talk about communication, we talk about research, we talk about implementation, and we work on those ideas. So we're touching base all the time on these things. And if the lesson components have to change, need to change on the basis of what we're learning from research, then we try to do that in a, in an orderly way by trying out things through research.
Okay, we've got a couple of other questions here too, so let me go through them. One of the questions from a participant is, how do you go about regrouping after an area might have lost some of their momentum?
Oh my goodness! After, I wonder if we mean there that they've dropped Reading Recovery, or.
Emma, I think it was around folks were looking at the 2 million slide,
right,
and looking at the two tails, and saying, so maybe after the height in 2000 or so, and then some of the decline, how do you think as an organization or an effort of regrouping?
That was the worst of times. It was around the period of Reading First grants that were going to states and districts, which couldn't be used for Reading Recovery for whatever reason. We weren't able to grow because of Reading First funding. And there was an Inspector General report that looked into that whole process. So that time from 2001 until really, I'd say 2010, that was really hard. We continued as faculty to meet. We monitored because of our ongoing data collection. We monitored the loss. I'd say, that we just kept doing what we knew was right and really stepped up our communication and work with superintendents, and basically kept going, kept it together, waiting for the next opportunity to really scale up, which came with the I3 grant. It's very hard. I mean, I think it's important to study where you're not successful. There's that whole school of thought that you learn more from your failures than you do your successes. Getting into those districts and trying to understand why it was dropped, it's, often not because there's not money to do it, it's because there's a different priority, and trying to understand the priority, I think is important, changing priorities.
Emily, we've got we have actually a series of questions for both you and Tom. What I'm going to suggest, and we can follow up after the session, is that we'll post them on the learning community. Would you and Tom be willing to start or kind of start the conversation around a few of those questions after the webinar?
Yes. Would you like us to stay on and?
Yeah. No, I mean in the online learning community. So I'll follow up with both you and Tom to do that. But there's everything from working with sites and ensuring fidelity to finding resources after the I3 grant and thinking about scale up and next steps after that for both of you. So we'll put those on the learning community in the discussion area. There's going to be a link to that discussion included in the evaluation at the end. So we've just got five more minutes, and I thank you, you and Tom, for your time and sharing your lessons learned around scaling up and implementation. If we can go to the next slide. And actually one more. So we've, slide 27. So we've heard from 2 grantees who've had quite a bit of success, but also some challenges along the way in scaling up effective practices. Kathy, at the beginning of the session today, shared a framework that can help in thinking about how your organization has approached scaling up or could in the future. The readiness assessment that's on the screen is also included in the I3 learning community. It's a tool that we've used with some of our partners to help them reflect and think about, 1, their current status or readiness for scaling up an effort, or 2, just stepping back at a point in time during a scaling up process and reassessing the progress they've made to date. So there are three big readiness criteria or categories that were in the framework earlier: stakeholder management, organizational change, and implementation management. You'll see the big questions to consider around stakeholder management. Do stakeholders understand the purpose and feel motivated to implement the strategy? So that was the kind of buy-in and ownership that both Tom and Emily spent an amount of time identifying as a success for their continued sustainability and scaling up of efforts. The second is around organizational change. Do you have the time, resources, and knowledge to scale up effectively the key partners on the ground? So have you created that implementation environment conducive to the change? And then lastly, we didn't spend as much time on it, I think, on the call today, but really the implementation management piece of this. So we have the tools in place to plan, execute, and monitor the quality and level of implementation at scale. So just due to time, we were going to have Tom and Emily kind of react to the readiness assessment, but I think you've heard pretty clearly the themes in their presentation that we've tried to capture and give you a tool for reflection with your own teams, if that's maybe a good place to start.
Thank you, Tom. And I want to thank, again, all of our participants today on this I3 webinar, as well, particularly Tom and Emily for sharing the success and the challenges with their two very important and helpful grants that they're working on to help students in our country. Again, we're going to shift questions and hopefully get a discussion going on the I3 website. The resources will be available in the learning community, as well as being able to participate in this discussion with Tom and Emily. So please stay on the line after we finish to complete the evaluation. And we thank everyone for your participation, and particularly, again, want to thank Tom and Emily. Have a great day. Good luck.